This is a KORN 6 News breaking news alert.
And our breaking news at 6 o'clock, the Ninth Circuit Court will convene 11 judges to now review President Trump's push to deploy the National Guard to Portland. For now, the deployment is still on hold. The Trump administration argues federal officers at the ICE facility are needed for additional protection. Once again, that court decision coming down just within the hour at 6 o'clock. I'm Jeff Gianola.
And I'm Elizabeth Din. Let's bring in our Joelle Jones. She's been tracking this case since the start, live now to get us up to speed on this breaking news update. Joelle?
Well, good morning, America. This is Stuart Ryan once again, bringing you news of fresh, weird occasions and actions with an odd set of breaking news that confuses me and probably will confuse you as well. The podcast is titled, Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals on Banc, Unholy Mess, with a subtitle, Breaking News. The Ninth Circuit is to rehear Judge Invoked's order in Oregon versus Trump. So, having said all of that, on the one hand, the Ninth Circuit has denied an en banc rehearing in Newsom versus Trump, if you remember, meaning that the full court will not reconsider a previous panel decision. This decision upholds the panel's ruling that allows President Trump to maintain federal authority over California National Guard troops deployed in Los Angeles during protests, effectively siding with the federal government on the matter. The denial of an en banc review upholds the original panel's finding that the president likely acted lawfully under 10 U.S.C. 12406, a completely nonsensical, non-jurist, idiotic decision by 2 Trump judges out of the 3. Now, Trump remains barred from deploying the National Guard in Portland following a federal appeals court ruling involving the very same law that was at stake in Newsom versus Trump, that is 10 U.S.C. 12406. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed on Tuesday that it would rehear a case over the president's authority with a broader court of 11 judges. That's known as an en banc hearing or rehearing. The appeals court also vacated a ruling from a 3-judge panel of last week that sided with the Trump administration.
Yes, Liz, Jeff, this really came down to the wire just as the Ninth Circuit's court's decision to temporarily pause federal deployment of the National Guard was set to expire. The court voted to halt troops into Portland until a larger panel of 11 judges can fully review this case. Now, legal experts tell me that process usually takes several weeks, but they say this case has been expedited. Everything from the hearings to this trial has been expedited, and that's as unless a higher court intervenes, a 3-day trial is set to start tomorrow.
Moving forward, the order is the latest development in a long legal saga over whether Donald Trump has the authority and justification to deploy National Guard forces in Portland, just like he has in L.A. The Oregon City has had about 200 federalized Guard members in limbo since late September, when Trump attempted to mobilize in response to months of so-called protests there. And I should add that protests have nothing to do with invasions by foreign powers or rebellion which is exemplified by January 6th insurrectionists, and does not indicate in and of itself that local law enforcement and state law enforcement cannot and have not handled whatever protests there may or may not have been. So what's happened here? Well, first, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals denied a request for an en banc rehearing of its earlier panel decision in Newsom versus Trump, allowing troop deployment. The outcome, that denial means a previous ruling is now effectively the final word from the Ninth Circuit, allowing the federal government to maintain control over the National Guard troops deployed in Los Angeles. Although I have no bloody idea what happens should Oregon prevail in Oregon v. Trump en banc rehearing that might overrule Newsom versus Trump, or it might merely sit side by side in insane conflict. Now, a majority of eligible judges voted against rehearing the case of Newsom, right? However, in Oregon versus Trump, the very same court, the Ninth Circuit, decided to have an en banc rehearing of a rather non-distinguishable case.
The idea that a president would want to nationalize and deploy the state National Guard against the wishes of the sitting governor, just about everything about this case is not normal.
A federal case over the limits of presidential power on the fast track. Earlier this month, Oregon successfully won a temporary restraining order to stop federal troops from being sent into Portland. But after a 2-1 decision last week, the Ninth Circuit sided with the Trump administration, saying the president had the authority to federalize 200 Oregon Guard members. Trump praising the triumph shortly after.
You would think that would be common sense. We have the right to use the National Guard to put out trouble. Well, that's, how I got elected.
But just 4 days later, the appeals court paused its own ruling, blocking troops from hitting the streets of Portland until at least 5 p.m. tonight to allow time for all 11 judges of the court to consider a full en banc review. I asked Professor of Law Tung Yin what happens if they do.
They may just not say anything about the trial, or they might say the trial should be stayed until pending the resolution of the en banc. It could go different ways.
In another twist, on Monday, the DOJ walked back key evidence used to defend Trump's deployment during their appeal. In a letter to the court, attorneys for the Trump administration apologized, admitting they miscounted the number of Federal Protective Service officers, clarifying there were only 86 officers deployed to Portland instead of the 115 originally cited, writing, "We deeply regret these errors."
I mean, it's just really bad for the lawyer because then you lose credibility in the eyes of the judge.
The significance is that a decision in Newsom upholds the president's authority in this specific instance, which could have broader implications for the balance of power between federal and state governments during domestic unrest, and I don't like that phraseology. The decision in Oregon temporarily prevents Trump from deploying troops. So, there was a dissenting opinion in the Newsom case. Some judges had expressed criticism of the court's decision not to rehear the case in Newsom, with one dissenting judge suggesting the court might have been waiting for a similar case in Oregon to resolve, that case being Oregon versus Trump. But what effect has that on Newsom? We have no bloody idea. Of course, we know where all this judicial nonsense winds up. The Supreme Court will of course, accept a writ of certiorari, probably by Trump. And what's really notable is that normally the Supreme Court, will take cases that are interesting, where it involves a split in rulings and decisions from multiple circuits. while here we possibly have a split within one particular circuit depending on the kind of decision and opinion the Banc court takes in its rehearing of Oregon versus Trump. Now, if you're confused by this, so am I. And hopefully somebody will come on social media who's a legalist, a constitutionalist, and give some further explication. I can only point it all out to you and explain the best I can about what's happening. So here, in my understanding, we have a bizarre instance of judicial idiocracy, where in the same circuit, having two cases that are virtually identical, indistinguishable on the law and on factual findings of the two trial courts, in consideration of en banc rehearings, where one case succeeds in obtaining that and the other fails to obtain the rehearing. This is insane. Finally, just remember that the phrase "a house divided cannot stand," meaning that a group with internal conflict and a lack of unity is going to fail. That's a biblical saying, supposedly originating from our friend Jesus, but it was famously used by Abraham Lincoln in his 1858 House Divided speech, which argued for an end to slavery and set the stage for his presidency. And I think that saying is very much appropriate today to describe any group, organization, or even a nation that is weakened by internal division, and this is what we are enduring in our present state of democratic decline. There you have it. Please subscribe, comment, analyze, criticize, do something. We still have to defeat this idiotic algorithm, which is a creature probably conditioned and sent here by the Atlas rocket or comet, whichever you prefer to believe. Thank you.
Now, in response to the Ninth Circuit taking up this case en banc, Attorney General Dan Rayfield stated in part, "This ruling shows the truth matters and that the courts are working to hold this administration accountable. The Constitution limits the president's power, and Oregon communities cannot be treated as a training ground for unchecked federal authority." Now, based on the only half a page submitted by the Ninth Circuit, it's unclear if or how this decision will impact the timing of this trial, which is expected to start right behind me tomorrow.